Well, those of you who were here a few weeks ago noticed that at the start of my sermon, I was pretty distracted. So I need to apologize to you because what some of you know I've talked about before, but some of you don't know, is I can see all the way to the parking lot from where I stand right now. And actually, it's very easy to see all the way to the parking lot. There's things that happen out there. 4th of July, there was a Shetland pony running in circles while I was preaching. That was really distracting, to name one of many things. But there were a few that told me that they felt like we were in danger. I'm sorry if I made you feel that way. That is not how I would respond if we were in danger, okay? I've actually done some training with the Arapahoe County Police Department. I've been through myself preaching and others through some emergencies during the sermon. So I assure you I'd handle it much differently. I'd be much more stern. I would be giving you directions like to sit down or where to exit. We have people stationed around the room ready to address the issue. If I felt like there was something going on out there that was that serious, I would probably ask someone to go out there and work on it. That is not what was going on. What was going on is there were two teenagers from town in the church parking lot. And I knew both of them, Luke and Simon. Luke and Simon were on the wrestling team with Hudson and I. Luke and Simon are great Christian men, and they hardly ever miss a Young Life. They've taught at Young Life, but they're just in the parking lot. I'm like, what is going on? So eventually they come in and they go straight for the donuts, which understandable. And they're over there, but they're over there for a while. I'm like, what is going on? Okay, so my mind starts wandering, and here's what I'm thinking, which might be a scary thought. So they know Hudson and I, so one of two things probably happened. A, there was some sort of tragedy, right? And it's really important that they tell Hudson and I about it, which I'm like, okay, what could that be? Or second, they're playing a prank on Hudson and I, okay? And so I'm like, what is the prank going on right now? Like, are they about to pop up out of this store? Or, what's going on? I'm like watching Hudson to see if Hudson might know what's going on. Should I tell Hudson to, hey, go out to the lobby? These are my inner dialogue. So after a while, if you were here a few weeks ago, you noticed that eventually they came in and they sat down on the row with us next to Hudson. And I was like, oh, well, all it is two teenage boys who don't know how to work a clock and don't know when service starts, right? That's it. So I felt less distracted in that moment, and I was able to focus on my main task, preaching in the moment. And that's the reason I share this story with you today, because the first Christians to hear Hebrews were distracted too. They were very distracted. They were the second generation of Christians after the first eyewitnesses to the Gospels, and they were trying to figure out what it meant to be Christians, but they were tempted. They were distracted because they were distracted by going back to Judaism. They were facing severe persecution and suffering, and because of the suffering they were facing, they were considering going back. See, we will do almost anything to avoid suffering. And suffering is one of the worst characteristics we live through in our fallen world. And so the number one strategy when we're going through suffering is distraction. How can we distract ourselves through this time of suffering? So dealing with suffering and distraction, the Hebrew preacher keeps preaching his sermon. Pray with me before we get into it. God, it can be so easy to go through life distracted, without focus, or wandering. I pray this morning that your Spirit would give us eyes to see the bigger picture of what Jesus did and is doing in the world, that it may give us focus in life even when we are suffering. Pour through me the gift of preaching, that the endurance of Christ will be formed in our hearts. It's in Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Open up your Bibles with me to Hebrews chapter 2. We must pay the most careful attention, therefore, to what we have heard, so that we do not drift away. For since the message spoken through the angels was binding, and every violation and disobedience received its just punishment, How shall we escape if we ignore so great a salvation? This salvation, which was first announced by the Lord, was confirmed to us by those who heard him. God also testified to it by signs, wonders, and various miracles, and by the gifts of the Holy Spirit distributed according to his will. I once walked up to preach a sermon, and the lady on the front row sitting in front of me literally was asleep. Head back, mouth open, everything. I hadn't even started yet. I was like, she's nowhere close to paying attention. What do I do with this? And the preacher of Hebrews is saying, listen up, pay attention. And there's a deeper meaning than just paying attention. And we misread this if we don't understand this. This is much deeper than just tapping your kid on the shoulder and saying, hey, pay attention during church. There is something important going on here. In fact, if you don't pay attention to this, you're in danger. You're in danger of drifting away. And if you look up what drifting away is in the Greek, it's actually, the word for it in Greek is called hooligan. Now, let me tell you, the hooligan race yesterday was a little bit of a disappointment. But I tell you, we sit in the wrong spot during the hooligan race, okay? You shouldn't sit up there where everyone else is. You should go where Susan's at the search and rescue, okay? That's where things are happening. That's where you see the image of drifting away. Ask Susan about what was happening yesterday while we were all sitting there bored. She'll fill you in. There was lots of drifting away, and some of it was due to water and some of it was due to other substances. But here's the lesson for us spiritually. In fact, if you don't pay attention as a Christian to this deeper truth, then you're in danger of drifting away. And we don't want to drift away. We as Christians can do the same thing as hooligans can. We can drift away. So verse 2 and 3 give a logical argument here as to what we are to do. He's talking about this violation of the law and everything is punished. What is being referenced here is the Old Testament law. The Old Testament law and the huge burden it was to follow all the laws, to give all the sacrifices. And the question for these Jewish Christians is, okay, you're suffering, can leave this suffering, but do you want to go back to that? Do you want to go back to that legalism, that way of living? Without Christ, are you really better off? I mean, the question we must consider when we consider drifting away is drifting away really the better option in life? Verse 3 is saying, why would you ignore such a great salvation? Let me put it this way. If you were to receive a presidential pardon, would you turn it down? Would you say, oh, I'll just stay in the prison cell, it'll be fine? No, you would be so excited. That's what the Hebrew preacher is saying here. You have received so much grace, so much freedom from Jesus. Why not live into that? Why are you trying to give this away? And so verse 4 shows us all the ways in which God miraculously provided for them that are outlined in the Gospels and the book of Acts. And they and we need to hear sometimes that the grass isn't greener on the other side of Christianity. It's not better. And the book of Hebrews is insisting that we as Christians should stick to what we got rather than abandoning it. But not just abandoning it, we must pay closer attention. We must go deeper into the truth of the Gospels, and we must see that we belong to Jesus. And so now the Hebrew writer is going to flesh this out for us. It is not the angels that he has subjected the world to come, about which we are speaking. But there is a place somewhere one has testified. What is mankind that you are mindful of them? A son of man that you care for him. You made them a little lower than the angels. You crowned them with glory and honor and put everything under their feet. In putting everything under them, God left nothing that is not subject to them. Yet at the present, we do not see everything subject to them. But we do see Jesus, who was made lower than the angels for a little while, now crowned with glory and honor because he has suffered death, so that by the grace of God he may taste death for everyone. Now the Hebrew author is still ranting about the angels. And preachers go on rants sometimes. It's biblical, okay? Deal with it. And if you remember last week, the controversy is that Jewish Christians are tempted to make Jesus just one of the angels. Like, oh yeah, Jesus did some good things, but angels did too, and we'll just make him just another angel that visited. And the preacher of Hebrews is not cool with this. He will not relent until he pounds into their heads that Jesus is so much more than an angel. So he quotes Psalm 8 here, which is this beautiful passage that reminds humanity where we are placed in the Garden of Eden with dominion over everything, to rule over the world. But he does a little change here. Instead of talking about humanity, he replaces it with the word Son of Man, which should set off alarm bells in the mind of every Christian, because the main way Jesus referred to himself is as the Son of Man. It is a way of describing himself as the new Adam, which means humanity, this new, true human being. And the point is, the true human being is now in place, is now seated, ruling over the world. Yet, there's this weird exception. There's this tongue twister line that doesn't make sense. Nothing is not subject to Jesus, but we do not see everything subject to Jesus. How does that fit together in the same Jesus? Well, or in the same sentence. It's the way of saying that Jesus' kingdom has come and is being ushered in. He is anointed as king, but yet the battle between darkness and evil and good is still raging on. We still have darkness and death, yet God is fighting, Jesus is fighting to rule over all of creation, even in its brokenness. So it is this belief that God is ruling over all things, but not all things are yet under his authority. And so we stand in faith. And this leads to the thesis statement of really all of the book of Hebrews, but it's actually more like a graph than a thesis statement. Remember, the early church didn't have projectors and big screen TVs, so the preacher had to explain things to them with words, and so I'm going to use modern technology to show it to you. So first, on the top left, you have Jesus. Since the beginning of time with God in heaven. This is John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him and nothing was made. And so the incarnation is Jesus descending down to earth. It was a journey of descent. Jesus leaving heaven to become human, breaking through into our three-dimensional world. And for a little while, he was lower than the angels. But being faithful, a faithful Son of God, Jesus proved himself as the true human. So now Jesus has ascended back up into heaven. He has broken through the dimension, and he is now ruling over all things in heaven once again. And so a good deal of this letter is now devoted to this fact of explaining how this comes about and what it means. But for the moment, we should just celebrate. We celebrate this fact that in Jesus, God has already dealt with death on our behalf and is ruling the world as its rightful Lord. Knowing this biblical truth, we are now ready to hear as the Hebrew preacher expands on this. In bringing many sons and daughters to glory, it was fitting that God, for whom through everything exists, should be made the pioneer of salvation, perfect through what he suffered. Both the one who makes people holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. He says, I will declare your name to my brothers and sisters. In the assembly I will sing your praises. And again, I will put my trust in him. And again, he says, here am I, and the children God has given me. Since the children have flesh and blood, he too shared in their humanity, so that by his death he might break the power of him who holds the power of death, that is the devil, and free those who all their lives have been held in slavery by their fear of death. For surely it is not the angels he helps, but Abraham's descendants. For this reason he had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. Because he himself suffered when he was tempted, he is able to help those who are now being tempted. Now, in order to understand what was just said before, this image, this graph, the Hebrew preacher gives us four images of who Jesus is. Now, I used artificial intelligence to make all four of these images of Jesus. I'm not joking about that, actually. And here's the first. Jesus is the pioneer. We love to celebrate pioneers. Lewis and Clark, Marco Polo, the Pinta, the Nina, the Santa Maria. We admire astronauts when they go and explore on space. Neil Armstrong walking on the moon. But we often forget to include Jesus in this category. The Greek word for pioneer can be translated also as hero, champion, founder, author, guide, leader, and scout, among other things. And why did Jesus go all through these things? Because Jesus is the pioneer of defeating death. According to a study of the National Health Institute, they asked people about their greatest fears. The number one greatest fear of people was public speaking. Now you know how I feel when I'm up here. The second greatest fear is death. Which also ironically means the person at the funeral would rather be in the casket at the funeral than the one preaching the service. Interesting irony, right? But we will go to great lengths to deny death. Think about that this week. Where in your life or where in the world around you do you see people denying death? This study was the life's work of a psychologist named Ernest Becker. But in Churches of Christ, we have our own psychologist. He's an elder at a church in Abilene, Richard Beck, who wrote one of the best theological books I've ever written on Hebrews 2, verses 14 and 15. Here it is if you want to read it sometime. See, the thing the devil uses against us is death. It's the thing that is dangled behind us, that scares us, that prevents us from doing bold and brave things for God. But Jesus went to the grave and came out of that grave as a hero, as the true superhero of the world, defeating death for humanity. The second image is of a big brother. One of the best movies of all time is A River Runs Through It. It takes place in the beautiful mountains of Montana, and Brad Pitt is in his prime, but that's not the reason why it's such a good movie. It's about two brothers. Two brothers, one older brother, one younger brother, who had grown apart. The younger brother was making terrible decisions, but they had grown apart so much, the older brother could not save the younger brother, and eventually it led to the younger brother's demise. But this is the beauty of what is the image that is given to us in chapter 2, is that Jesus is the older brother, the sibling who is willing to leave heaven to make us his brothers and sisters, to make us his siblings. The third image of Jesus is as a liberator. Immediately would have gone through the mind of the first readers as Abraham's descendants. Abraham's descendants being held in captivity and slavery and bondage in Egypt. and where God would perform the Exodus, where God would systematically dismantle all the gods of Israel, or all the gods of Pharaoh, and point that he is the one true God, setting them free by parting the sea. And Jesus is now the same liberator, but he is liberating us from death. And this leads to the fourth and final image of Jesus as the high priest. In ancient Israel, the high priest was responsible for making the sacrifice of atonement for the sins of the people. And as a high priest, it's described here that Jesus is both merciful and faithful. Faithful to the law, but merciful to us unable to follow it. But more than that, as the high priest, Jesus is giving of the ultimate sacrifice, himself, to reconcile us to him. And so these four images serve together to build on for us the foundation of Hebrews, where we see this thesis of what God is doing. And so the second step, as we learn how to live in endurance in the book of Hebrews, is how to see the world differently. See, the goal of the book of Hebrews is to build endurance in the disciples of Jesus. And the problem the Hebrew church is having is the same problem we can still have today. It's how we see life. It's how we view Jesus' teachings. So we'll come back to this chart. And I want you to notice the split. The split between heaven and earth. We generally think of heaven as above and earth below, which can be helpful, but it's also helpful to think of them as two different dimensions, that heaven is a different dimension that we don't fully have access to, but it breaks through at times through works of the Holy Spirit and Jesus. But the problem is how we view this story, which perspective we have when we view the story of Jesus. You see, most people generally know in our culture today, even as post-Christian as it might be, what the cross is and the story of the cross. Actually, one Easter, Aubrey's coworkers were talking with her. They were preparing for a Good Friday, and a Christian coworker, was talking about it. And another coworker who wasn't a Christian said, "Whoa, Jesus dies? Don't spoil the story for me." She was joking. She was humorous about it. You see, we often forget that the story of Jesus' life and death on the surface is a deep embarrassment. The peril of the incarnation lies in the fact that when taken out of context, it is a discouraging story of bitter defeat. If one looks at the story of Jesus through an earthly view, through the lower view, through what just happens here on earth, it is seen as a mournful story of a victim overpowered by his enemies. Viewed this way, from Jesus' birth to the cross, is a disparaging story. This story of despair, where one who courageously takes on all the powers of the world, and then those powers turn around and kill him. But the preacher is trying to get us to see the story a different way. And in order to see the story a different way, we have to see Jesus' life through heaven's eyes. Because above the line is where Jesus is now. And if we were to look above the line from heaven's point of view, we would see what is going on here. We see that the cross, that Jesus' life, Jesus' ministry, is this indescribable expression of love displayed for us. That God would leave heaven to be one of us. As the song goes, just a slob like one of us, trying to make their way home. And that God would be the pioneer, doing for us what we could not do for ourselves. The liberator, setting us free, being the atoning sacrifice, being this big brother who loved us enough to go through all of these things for us. That is the image the Hebrew writer is trying to get us to see, if only we have the eyes to see it. And this is why the chapter ends talking about suffering. Because as humans, one thing that we do know in this broken world is we know what it's like to suffer. And we often ask, and one of the biggest questions we wrestle with in life is, what is the meaning of this suffering? Life is difficult. Anyone who has ever fought addiction, wept over a troubled child, discovered a malignant cancer, cried out for injustice, worried about making a mortgage payment, coping with a disability, or grieving at the graveside of a loved one knows what it means to suffer. We walk through hospitals, battlefields, courtrooms, and prisons. We can smell and touch suffering here on earth. But Hebrews is saying, can you smell and touch something else? Hebrews is calling us to see the hope we have in Jesus if we can just see the world through heaven's eyes. That God himself did not avoid suffering, but took on suffering for us. Because he himself was suffered and tempted in every way and went through it and overcame it as the hero for us. And that is precisely how Jesus relates to us, because Jesus gave of himself and overcame suffering to be united with us. And so service ended a couple weeks ago. Simon and Luke were sitting next to us, and about the time service got over, as quickly as I could ask them, I said, "What is going on, guys?" And before Hudson could sell them out, they came and they told me, "Hey, we wanted to go surfing down at the river, and we were trying to pick up Hudson. And Hudson wouldn't leave. We kept texting him, we kept bugging him, and Hudson refused to leave service to the point where they gave up on convincing Hudson. They're like, you know what, we'll just join him. We'll just sit in here until service is over." And so now Hudson is an example for us all of what it means to pay attention, to focus on what is greater, on what is more important than just surfing at the river. Because have you ever seen people surf at the river? You can't right now because it's too dangerous, right? But if you ever watch them, even if you watch the very best surfers, you know what happens to all of them? They all end up falling and drifting away. They all take a swim downriver. They all take a hard fall. But there's a way to avoid those falls in life. And the bigger picture is to come here and to work diligently to see the world through heaven's eyes, to see the bigger picture of what God is not just doing in the world, but what God is doing in the cosmos as he fights this battle of good and evil. So can you see the deeper meaning? That the emblem of suffering and shame, the cross, is actually how God defeated the world. Can you live into it? Can you follow it? If so, church, I encourage you to turn your eyes upon Jesus as we stand and sing.